This is a video for my administrative law class and also for my legislation and regulation class, because we're going to talk about a case that matters for both classes. And it's either a primary case in your casebook or is talked about in the notes and in some of the other cases that we're studying so much that we really need to learn about it. And we're talking here about Myers versus United States. So let's take a look at our slides. So again, we're talking about the old case, Myers versus United States from 1926. And the bottom line is the Supreme Court holds that a statute is unconstitutional in this case because it required Senate approval before the president could remove one of his appointees. And we're talking about a postmaster in a local satellite office of the post office. Here's the individual we're talking about. This is Frank Myers, and President Wilson removed him in 1920. He was a first-class postmaster, which basically means the person running the office in Portland, Oregon, back in the teens and 20s, or in the late teens. He was first appointed in 1913. So Myers had been a Democratic Party kind of activist, or party operative. He was very active. He supported some people's campaigns to Congress and was rewarded for that, but with this kind of cushy job in running the local post office. It was it paid well, and you got a position of authority. And this was the way that politicians in Washington would reward people who helped them get elected by giving them post office positions. So he received his first appointment in 1913. His first term, which was 4 years, was pretty uneventful. We don't know much about it. And then, so President Wilson reappointed him in 1917. And then as the sources say, his tenure soon became engulfed in controversy. And he had all sorts of problems. So he had a falling out with some influential politicians. The congressman who had, or a person in Congress who had been his sort of political patron, had retired from political life and wasn't there to protect him anymore. And he really had a problem with one of his subordinates who raised a number of complaints and accusations, and he in turn blamed all of whatever this was about on the subordinate itself. So there was a lot of tension and fighting and mutual accusations. So this eventually goes all the way up to the White House, and President Wilson asks for his resignation on the advice of some members of Congress who were kind of fed up with Myers. And I want to point out that one thing that's unusual about this case compared to the other removal cases is that Myers is actually from the same political party as Wilson. So this isn't like a Democrat removing a Republican or vice versa. He's actually removing somebody that he appointed from his own party, who is just having too many conflicts with people. And so Myers refuses to leave. And so Wilson just sends a telegram saying you're terminated, therefore. And so Myers, it says he eventually vacated his office under protest. So apparently there was some discussion about whether he was even going to leave or if he was going to keep coming into work. And then to bolster his claim for his unpaid salary, because he planned to challenge this in court, Myers didn't seek work anywhere else until the end of his appointed term, which was another year or year and a half. And so he intentionally kind of stayed home and stayed out of work so that nobody could say, well, we should only have to pay you the difference or something. Now, what's the statute in question? We kind of have two statutes that are why this case matters. There was an 1876 federal law so this is right after the Civil, this is a Reconstruction era statute after the Civil War, provided that postmasters of the first, second, and third classes shall be appointed and may be removed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so during the Reconstruction eras, just so you know, there was a lot of conflict between Andrew Johnson and and Congress. And so Congress started passing these statutes that he had to get their approval in order to remove government officials from the executive branch, because the concern was that Johnson was corrupt and was purging the executive branch and appointing people that were loyal to him and so forth. And these people had terms of office that they were supposed to be in there for. So basically they decided the Constitution doesn't say anything about removal by Senate confirmation, but it also doesn't prohibit it. So Congress said you have to get a confirmation to remove people if you have to get it confirmed to appoint them. So Myers argued that his dismissal violated this law, which on its surface it seemed to, because it didn't spell out any reason to do it and the president hadn't sought Senate confirmation. By the way, I don't think any of the legal minds at the time, this is taking place in 1920, thought that this was actually constitutional or would survive. But Myers' own lawyer probably thought that the government would settle the case and pay him some money or something like that, so that just to avoid the nuisance of litigating it. So, but he claimed he was entitled to back pay for the unfilled portion of his 4-year term. Now, there's this other statute that was the bigger deal in the background, and this was the Tenure of Office Act of the United States that was also passed a little earlier in 1867, so immediately after the Civil War. It was intended to restrict the power of the president to remove certain office holders without approval of the Senate. So it had very similar provisions to the postmaster statute in question in Myers. Now, that law was enacted in March 2nd, 1867, over the veto of President Andrew Johnson. By the way, I misspoke earlier and said that the postmaster statute was during the Johnson era. It was this statute that was during the Johnson era, and the postmaster statute was in 1876. I apologize. So Andrew Johnson actually vetoed it, and Congress overrode his veto. And it purported to deny the president a power to remove any executive officer who had been appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate, unless the Senate approved the removal during the next full session of Congress. Now, Congress repealed the Tenure in Office Act in its entirety in 1887, exactly 20 years after it was enacted. And so at the time, it was of a dubious constitutionality. It was never really invoked. And then Congress repealed it because it seemed kind of pointless. But remember that in the intervening years, between 1867 and 1887, at the midway point, they had passed this postmaster statute that had a very similar clause. So while evaluating the constitutionality of the statute in Myers, the Supreme Court also held that the Tenure of Office Act, which had already been repealed, was also unconstitutional. And so this was probably what most people thought at the time, but the Supreme Court had actually never weighed in on the issue. And I hope you can see that this is a little weird that they're going ahead and adding, in dicta, I guess, that other statute, which was a much bigger deal because it applied to all sorts of executive officers, would also have been unconstitutional. The court noted that the Constitution is silent on their dismissal, but concluded it was implicit that in the Constitution that the president had exclusive power to remove executive branch officers whose existence was an extension of the president's own authority, and the statute thus violated the separation of powers. Kind of closing thoughts here. Myers, by some accounts, is the first decision in the history of the nation to invalidate a congressional statute on the grounds that it violated an inherent Article 2 power of the president. And so we've had lots of statutes invalidated up to this point on other constitutional grounds, but this seemed to be kind of cutting new ground. Now, the justice who wrote the opinion for the majority is Chief Justice Taft, who had actually been president. So he's the only Chief Justice to have served both. It also served as president of the United States, which gave him a unique perspective on presidential powers. So he was president for a while. He leaves the White House, and then he gets himself appointed to the Supreme Court. And so Justice Taft's decisions about the power of the president are very insightful because he'd actually had the job and knew kind of about the day-to-day workings within the White House. Also, keep in mind that the post office itself, which was the institution or the government entity at issue in Myers, has since been significantly reconstituted as an independent agency. And I'm making this video in the fall of 2020, when we've actually had a lot of issues about the president's recent appointee of the Postmaster General and his policies during an election year of scaling back the post office and getting rid of sorting machines and drop boxes and things like that. And so the post office has suddenly become very controversial during this particular election year. And the appointment of the Postmaster General is an issue. And so we're not dealing with the same statutory framework for the post office that we had in 1920 or 1926 when this case was decided. You should be aware that in the intervening years, it was reconstituted, so the post office is supposed to be a little more independent. Okay, I have a quick review question for my students watching this. Could Congress pass a statute requiring Senate approval or confirmation when the president wants to remove an appointed executive official? Yes or no? Now, this is supposed to be an easy question. If you don't know the answer to that or you're not confident, you really should rewatch the video because you missed something important. Okay, and that concludes our lecture on Myers versus United States.